Our scripture reading this morning comes to us from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verses 1 through 17, and I'll be reading from the Common English Bible. When Mordecai learned what had been done, he tore his clothes, dressed in mourning clothes, and put ashes on his head. Then he went out into the heart of the city and cried out loudly and bitterly. He went only as far as the king's gate because it was against the law for anyone to pass through it wearing mourning clothes. At the same time, in every province and place where the king's order and his new law arrived, a very great sadness came over the Jews. They gave up eating and spent whole days weeping and crying out loudly in pain. Many Jews lay on the ground in mourning clothes and ashes. When Esther's female servants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, the queen's whole body showed how upset she was. She sent everyday clothes for Mordecai to wear instead of mourning clothes, but he rejected them. Esther then sent for Hathach, one of the royal eunuchs whose job it was to wait on her. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was going on and why he was acting this way. Hathach went out to Mordecai to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him. He spelled out the exact amount of silver that Haman promised to pay into the royal treasury. It was in exchange for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave Hathach a copy of the law made public in Susa concerning the Jews' destruction so that Hathach could show it to Esther and report it to her. Through him, Mordecai ordered her to go back to the king to seek his kindness and his help for her people. Hathach came back and told Esther what Mordecai had said. In reply, Esther ordered Hathach to tell Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people in his province know that there's a single law in a case like this. Any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner courtyard without being called is to be put to death. Only the person to whom the king holds out the golden scepter may live. In my case, I haven't been called to come to the king for the past 30 days. When they told Mordecai Esther's words, he had them respond to Esther. Don't think for 1 minute that, unlike all the other Jews, you'll come out of this alive simply because you are in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very important time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. But who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be part of the royal family. Esther sent back this word to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and tell them to give up eating to help me be brave. They aren't to eat or drink anything for 3 whole days, and I myself will do the same, along with my female servants. Then, even though it's against the law, I will go to the king, and if I am to die, then die I will. So Mordecai left where he was and did exactly what Esther had ordered him. Here ends the reading. Spirit of God, stir up your people. Thanks be to God. Esther is this interesting book in the middle of our Old Testament. And what makes it interesting is a couple different things. First of all, if you're reading through it, you'll realize that there's no mention of God in this book at all. This fasting and prayer exercise that Esther does is as close as we get. She doesn't even say prayer, does she? She says fasting. Fast for 3 days. We assume that there's prayer. But this book, believe it or not, is meant to be kind of a comedy. It's supposed to be funny. We're so used to taking our scriptures seriously that sometimes as Christians we miss that some of them are written to be kind of humorous. Now, this humor is a little bit dark in Esther. Jonah, by the way, when we get to the book of Jonah, it's meant to be super funny and absolutely ridiculous, almost a comedy of errors, but we'll talk about that when we get there. But what Esther deals with is things that are hidden and things that are revealed. And it initiates the Jewish holiday of Purim, which is kind of like Halloween for them. If you've ever watched Jewish populations celebrate this holiday, they dress up in costumes, they hand out treats to one another. It's supposed to be a joyous time of celebration, all based on this book. And they gather in the synagogue and they read the entire book of Esther together because it's not that long. So if you've never read this book, I encourage you to read it. The whole backstory of Esther is that there's this king. King Artaxerxes is how he's identified in the book of Esther. He's the king of Persia. This is happening in the midst of the exile is still going on, or maybe some people have come back. Remember, we don't have any numbers. We don't know which Artaxerxes this is, if this is the one that stops construction or continues instruction. But anyway, he's there, and he throws a party. He throws a party for his peers and his officials, and it lasts for 180 days. Can you just imagine it? Can you imagine if our president threw a 180-day party on tax dollars, right? Might be a protest, but you don't protest what the king does back then, right? You just kind of let it go. And so the king throws this 180-day party, and then at the end of the 180-day party, most of the high officials and all of them go home, and then he throws a 7-day party for the wealthy people who live in the capital of Persia, who live in Susa with him. And at the end of 7 days, when they've been drinking wine this entire time, 7-day bender has been going on. The king of Persia calls his wife and says, "Hey, Vashti, why don't you come and show off how beautiful you are with your crown on? Just your crown on." And Vashti goes, "No," right? And when this happens, the king gets mad because nobody says no to the king of Persia, not even the queen. And his advisors say, "Oh, if you let her get away with this, every woman is going to think they can say no to things. You have to get rid of this woman. We can't have women saying no to things, especially not their husbands. If you can say no to the king of Persia, then you can say no to anybody." So Vashti goes away. And then the king decides that he actually does need a queen. And so there's this whole process where his advisors go and gather up a bunch of the most beautiful virgins that they can find in the city. And then these women go through a year-long spa treatment before they even meet the king, right? They get oils rubbed on them, and there's all this stuff that happens. I don't even know what goes on in a year-long spa treatment. And then they get one night to audition for the role of queen. You can imagine how that goes. And so it all culminates in Esther being chosen. Esther, the good Jewish girl, the poor Jewish orphan who's been living with her uncle Mordecai. And Mordecai is not unknown in the city of Susa. He's apparently well known enough that he's able to be around the courtyard of the king. And Esther, the reason she gets chosen is because she proves herself to be savvy and submissive to the advice that's given her, right? It points out things like she listened to what the eunuchs said. The eunuchs told her what the king would like, and she did exactly what she was told to do. So she has this streak of compliance in her. Mordecai is outside the gate, and there's this scene where Mordecai overhears eunuchs planning to assassinate the king, which is weird because eunuchs can't be royalty at this point. They don't have the ability to continue their line. And they're planning to assassinate the king because they're sick of him, and Mordecai gets word to the king of this assassination through Queen Esther and saves the king's life. And then we find out about this other character, Haman. Haman is not a Jew. He rises up to power in the king's court, and he becomes second in command. And everybody is commanded to kneel to him, except Mordecai doesn't. Mordecai doesn't kneel because Mordecai doesn't kneel to anybody except God Most High, right? So he doesn't kneel to Haman, and this just rubs Haman the wrong way. And Haman doesn't just seek revenge on Mordecai. Haman seeks to destroy the entire Jewish people. There's some other complicated things turning out. It turns out Haman is from a tribe of people that the Israelites beat in a war. And so there's some generational, I've always hated the Jews kind of thing going on in Haman's life. And so he uses this excuse of Mordecai being rebellious. He gets into the king's ear and he says, these people over here don't kneel when they're supposed to. Same thing that happened when Queen Vashti said, no, you cannot tolerate this rebellion in your kingdom. These people are evil. And so Haman is allowed to issue the order that at the end of the year, all of the Jews throughout the empire of Persia are supposed to be killed. This is in essence genocide. right? This would be the end of all the Jews in the world. And so Mordecai mourns. He puts on mourning and he reaches out to his niece who's positioned to talk to the king, but she caves for a second into her own fear and says, I don't want to die. And Mordecai points out, they may not know you're Jewish right now, but they're going to find out you're Jewish eventually. And then we find out a little bit about Mordecai's faith, and we discover that Mordecai believes that redemption is coming. Salvation is coming for the Jewish people, but Esther has an opportunity to participate in it or not. And she takes a bold risk. She goes into the king's presence, and he extends the gold scepter to her, and she does this brilliant thing. She invites the king and Haman to dinner, and that's all she asks. And then they have this beautiful dinner. You can imagine it's a lovely party, and the king is like desperate to know what Esther wants. And instead she says, I just want you to come to dinner tomorrow. Ooh, I forgot the best story. In the midst of all of this, the king has trouble sleeping. And so he has somebody come in and read to him the history of his own life. Isn't this fabulous? I can't sleep. Come tell me how awesome I am. And he finds out, he's told again of the story of Mordecai who saves his life. And it reads in the history that he never honored Mordecai. He never said thanks. And so he asks Haman, he says, Haman, what would you do for this man you want to honor? How would you honor him? And Haman's like, oh, he's talking about me. Well, I would put on the king's best robe, and I would put him on a horse, and I would send a high-ranking official to declare, this is the one whom the king honors. And so Haman is told to go do this for Mordecai the Jew who wouldn't kneel in his presence. All while still under the command that the Jews are going to be killed in a couple months. It is a weird story. So Haman has to do this, and then he gets really mad, so he builds gallows to hang Haman on, or to hang Mordecai on. I'm getting confused in all my names. And then Haman and the king are invited back to a second night of dinner with Esther. And finally, Esther says, I'm a Jew. You've ordered me killed. And Haman, you can just imagine, right? He's alone with the king and the queen, and he's just found out that he's ordered the queen to be executed. This dude's in trouble. So the king is livid, and he leaves the room, and Haman pleads for his life, and in the process of pleading for his life, he falls on Esther, and the king walks back in to find Haman on top of his wife. This is a bad day for Haman. Haman ends up being executed on the gallows he built for Mordecai. The king revokes his order to kill the Jews, and then there's this weird reversal where the Jews are allowed to defend themselves. And we find out that there were people who still tried to attack them throughout the empire of Persia. And they kill a certain number of people, and then it institutes this party for when the Jews were saved, and they end up being allowed to protect themselves. That's the book of Esther. It's all about reversals and revealing. It's all about interesting power dynamics. The king is a weird character, right? Everyone's kind of interesting and weird. But Esther is so fascinating to me because she is in this place where she understands herself to be powerless. She exists at the whim of the king. The king has already displaced one wife because she did something she wasn't supposed to do. She wasn't supposed to say no to him. And now her uncle is saying, you need to go and risk ticking this guy off again. This guy who sets people aside at the drop of a hat, who's spontaneous and impulsive and apparently likes to drink for days on end. Go in and talk to him and see if you can save us. And Esther, bless her heart, after fasting for 3 days and strengthening herself, she makes the choice to take this risk, right? She goes in and she sees the king, but she is so smart with what she does. She doesn't come right out in public in the midst of all his peers and challenge the law he just wrote. She makes him dinner. She gets him alone. She invites him to a party. She charms him. She is so savvy in this, in what she does. She uses what she has in order to accomplish God's great purpose without stepping outside or offending anybody. It's just such an interesting thing. When I was in seminary, I wanted to have, you have to remember, I was like 22 when I was in seminary. Okay, so keep that in mind. This was, almost 20 years ago that I was in seminary, so I've grown up a little bit since then. But I always was intrigued by this idea of Vashti and Esther together. And to have this debate about how you actually make social change happen. Does Vashti lead to progress or does Esther lead to progress? And I had set it up in my head as a dichotomy that these two were two different things, but it turns out that they're actually two sides of the same coin. Because we need Vashtis who are willing to say no and risk everything in order to witness to what they believe in. And we also need Esthers who are willing to be savvy and charming and work a little bit within the system to use their gifts to cause things to happen. It's not that it's Esther versus Vashti. It's both of these women working together to lead to change in the empire of Persia. What the heck does that mean for us? What do we do with this scripture? It's fascinating. It's hilarious. Well, I will tell you, most of the time, when Christians talk about the book of Esther, we love that line of, who knows, maybe you were born for such a time as this. Have you ever heard this as a motivational phrase in Christianity? It's true. It's easy for us to imagine that in the face of big problems that the world has, or in the face of a big ask, that we are powerless, that we have nothing to offer. But the lesson in the book of Esther is that when we pause and listen to God, when we take a moment to step back from the big ask, it turns out that we do have something to offer, that we are all powerful in some way. We have some gift. Now, it's okay to recognize our limitations and what we're able to offer. It's okay to be savvy, to be charming, to be intelligent. It's okay to say, I can't do this thing, but I can do this thing. I think about the character in the story of Mordecai. He could have come running into the court himself in the face of the king and tried to protest on behalf of his people, but he knew if he did that, he'd probably just end up killed himself and things would accelerate, right? Instead, he works through Esther to get his message across to the king twice. And so he recognizes his limitations, but he still has something to offer in this story. The same is true for us. We have answers within us. We have something to offer the world, the ability to address the big problems. We have an ability to make a dent in what the world is facing if we're willing to listen to God and allow God to work through us, if we're willing to take maybe one teeny tiny bold step forward, do something that feels a little bit uncomfortable. We might be surprised how God lifts us up and works through us in that way. And this book is not just for women. I hope I've shown that. This is so often used for just women's retreats, right? But this book is for everybody. Everybody who's ever felt powerless or felt like they didn't have something to offer. The book of Esther teaches us, one of the things it teaches us is that we do in fact have something to offer. And so today, as we hear how Esther stepped out in boldness to do something great on behalf of her people, I hope we feel inspired to say yes to what God is calling us to do. To say yes to those nudges that may make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, but if we would just take a teeny tiny little step and do them within the boundaries of who we've been created to be, that God is going to do something remarkable through us. Amen?